or if you do, you have to own it. So I think it's recording now, Jeffrey. But first of all, thanks so much for being willing to talk a little bit about your work and telling stories, changing the narratives. A show that I organized for the parish that now is not going to happen in the flesh and blood bricks and mortar world, but is going to exist as a catalog and online. And I just wanted to start by asking you about storytelling, because the show I organized around storytelling, and for me the ideas were telling stories is a great way of kind of merging fact and fiction, and also kind of subjectivity and objectivity, or like telling like maybe half-truths to tell larger truths. And I wanted just to know if you had often thought of yourself as a storyteller, and if your visual art was a way of telling stories.
Yes, but I think it took me a long time to come to the point of seeing myself that way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about all of the kind of stages of becoming a storyteller. And one that I was really focused on, and still am, is the idea of authorship. And I think that the kind of courage that it takes to author something original,
Mm-hmm.
and to establish a voice.
Mm-hmm.
And in particular, when you're dealing with cultural narratives, I don't want to be like the voice for Indigenous people or for Native American people, but inevitably that role comes with that kind of package in certain ways.
Mm-hmm.
So I think for a long time I kind of was really hesitant to kind of take the role, and I think the idea of kind of creating visual cues for like a narrative were maybe the things that I felt comfortable with, because I think of a story as kind of having like an arc and like a beginning, a middle, and an end. And in my case, I'm like in the eternal middle, and there's no conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
And I think of my practice as like that story, and the conclusion is kind of to be written by others in some ways. But now I do think, after working for so long, I have learned how to have a voice, and I have begun to think about what kinds of stories are, what do I want to commit to in terms of a story.
So would you say that you kind of slowly discovered that you could be an author without being authoritarian?
Yes. And I think partially, I mean, it has to do with the benefit of being a visual artist, and then all of the things that come along with that, so like having platforms to talk, to be an educator, to have your work written about. I have talked oftentimes before about having a career is sort of like a very broad platform, and I'm also, I don't dismiss all of the parts of being an artist outside of making the work, and I try to use those to collectively tell a story.
So would you say when you started out that being a storyteller was maybe looked down upon as the role of an artist? So there's kind of modernist residue about narrative or representation being problematic, or
I think about I imagine for some people it's still not taken seriously. I think for a lot of people, I've referred to my work, to myself and to others, as being really content driven. And I think I've grown up with some envy of artists who I feel like don't feel that sense of responsibility to delivering content, historical, cultural content. But I don't feel like it was ever really a choice on my part, because those spaces needed to be carved out and needed to be regulated. So it's been a process, definitely. And now, I don't know, I guess now, there are people who are interested in listening. And so I get asked sort of like, what's the story? What's important to you? Like, and especially at this point, I mean, it's sort of, people start talking about legacy and what do you want to leave behind.
Wow, early for that.
A little early for that, I think, too. But
I hope.
I hope so too. But I have begun to think about sort of like, well, yeah, like what is it I want to look back on and think I took part in, or you move past the whole thing about like you know, the gallery or like the show, and get to a point of thinking in a broader context, just as a person, like what kind of story do I want to leave behind?
Mm-hmm. Or, I mean, to me, it would be multiple stories. I mean, you say legacy, I just
Yeah.
pictured a life legacy, but I could also think of that in terms of a body of work, or, you know, a
Yeah.
decade of work. Like, what does one want things to be left around? I like how you refer to it as like, as putting together visual cues to leave
Yeah.
people. To me, there's
Yeah.
like a more collaborative element of that than an authoritarian element.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, collaboration is another thing that I've thought about a lot, because in the art world, I feel like oftentimes, you know, labels and words get thrown around pretty easily.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're spending time with them in your work or in your studio, like something like collaboration, for instance, you know, going back, my gosh, to like 2010, probably when I really started working with people, I they started off with the word collaboration, and then I realized actually I was commissioning, because we weren't spending enough time together. We weren't integrating ourselves into each other enough for it to really be considered collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
But then that kind of kicked off the idea of like, well, what do I mean by collaboration? You can collaborate with history, you can collaborate with text, you can collaborate with appropriation, you can collaborate with found objects and materials. So that, and people, you know, so that, yeah, I agree with you. I think it is a much more collaborative effort, and I'm comfortable with that. Like, I'm totally fine with, I think of myself as somebody who's like mixing and remixing, you know,
Uh-huh.
but I'm not the sole kind of genesis of the materials.
Uh-huh. Which to me would be kind of an old-fashioned idea of what the artiste with a capital A was, and it strikes me that you started out, you know, after that notion was, you know, kind of put to bed, you know, kind of dead, you know, especially like after Barth and Death of the Author, and
Yeah.
opening things up in a different kind of way of generating meaning.
I think it's really what I'm drawn to. I mean, part of it has to do with like, I think just my own personal like biographical narrative,
Mm-hmm.
and growing up moving around so much. You know, there's no way, you know, my experiences in Korea couldn't have existed without being living in the context of Korean culture and being a foreigner. And
Mm-hmm.
same thing with like any of the places where I lived, Germany, London, like those experiences are all about my relationship to something other than me, you
Uh-huh.
know? And I think so the story structure, and maybe this is a mistake on my part, was to think of it as this kind of simplistic linearity.
Uh-huh.
And my life has taught me that it is linear, but in an extremely broad context.
Uh-huh.
Like, you know, everything does kind of lead to the next thing, does kind of cause the next thing. But really, when you reveal all of the parts, it seems nonlinear.
Uh-huh.
You know?
Yeah.
And you kind of have to wonder, it's like, well, where does this part fit in?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And it might show up in a color choice, or it might show up in a sequence of things, or a timing, or even an experiment that doesn't actually make it into a final
Yeah.
artwork.
Or it might not fit in, right?
It may not fit in. Yeah.
I
and
love how
and
you
I think,
refer.
no,
Okay.
go ahead.
Yeah, I love how you refer to it as like your story was about yourself related to something larger than yourself or not yourself.
Yeah.
And it's just a really great way of thinking of what storytelling is, or what being an artist is
Yeah.
these days.
Yeah.
Because so much is like kind of shrinks, so much talk about art shrinks things back to just the artist, as if they're
Right.
this like, you know, soul generated meaning, this kind of genius, this one person doing their thing in their space that couldn't be done by anyone else. And to me, that's like, not to take anything away from artists or from you about like putting, you know, doing something different and new, but to me it is about um, more almost a matter of recycling. Like,
Mhm.
to me, there's only 26 letters in the English alphabet, and they can generate so many different words, sentences, and stories. And that doesn't mean that it's not part. I mean, part of it's used, and part of it's reused, and part of it's new.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
if you thought of like, you know, using color, shape, material, beads, text, songs is a kind of recycling.
There's also, it's funny, you know, I think about like I guess, let's say if you talked to me 10 years ago about storytelling, you said, Jeff, what is storytelling? I think of this person who like commands their presence, and they speak loudly and they use their body language and they kind of make eye contact and they move around the room. And I remember a time when I was just like, I couldn't do that. Like, I'm way too subconscious to do that. But I think to learn how to do that visually in a painting, in a sculpture, like that sort of things, I know now how to like play with these materials and make them rub up against each other and make sound or quieten down or sort of kind of vibrate is like a word that I use most often.
Uh-huh.
And now, some of the work going into like performance and video and time-based things, I think of that more as storytelling. And that was the challenge of it, was to sort of like put my body into the work and then to work with other bodies, because there are other bodies who do things differently than what my body does and looks different. And so that and that was really interesting, because then you're inviting all these other narratives in, and the power of those performances have to do with the narratives of those bodies, and the story that they tell collectively.
So would you say for you that storytelling is a form of conversation?
I think it can be. Yeah. I mean, I think I also got really fascinated. Maybe it kind of played off of me realizing how difficult it was to author and to have voice. Then as a teacher, when you see students who I know they have an interesting story to tell and they're scared to tell it, that they think no one's going to be interested. They think, and I see themselves shooting themselves in the foot constantly, and there's some simple things. It's like, breathe, don't forget to breathe, don't forget to connect, like those sorts of things. And I think I taught myself those things as well. That was the challenge of conversation when I would talk to people, and just kind of existing, really. So yeah, I mean, I became fascinated with people who are really good storytellers, and it was just like, I want to have that quality in me during my lifetime.
So do you think that came along with the greater confidence that you just like got more mature and less insecure? And
yeah, I mean, a lot of it has to do with, I always tell people, it's like, I feel like I have like a bag of tricks, and I know we all have bags of tricks, that it's just like, I know most of the people who I know are really good public speakers actually hate it. Like they still get nervous, and we've all just figured out a bag of tricks to get us through it. And I think there's also the kind of reciprocation of the people who are talking to you. So the course of my career I've received a lot of support of people wanting to hear my voice or wanting to like invite me to like share things, and it starts to grow. Your confidence starts to grow, and you start realizing, you're like, oh wait, hold on a minute, I'm going to take advantage of this minute or this talk, and I'm going to shift it up. I'm going to try something different. For me, some of those things have been, well, I'll tell you, here's an example. So like most artists, I go and I give talks at universities and colleges and things like that. And at some point, I just decided to stop scripting them. A long time ago, I stopped scripting them. And I just kind of like go up there, and it's more of a meditation about being present and just sort of just like sharing. And you just kind of share. I don't even try to presume who they are. But it's interesting when the audience starts talking back to you and starts speaking to you, it's like your vulnerability creates a safe place for somebody to ask a more interesting question, for them to like share something about themselves. And it's almost like, regardless of who the larger audience is, you're having a brief connection with an individual, and other people get to witness it. And that's what I feel like also with the quality that I hope happens in my work. Like, it's sort of like, I get comments from people who like, they bring their own narrative to it, and it's encouraged me to make work that allows for that projection. Like, it actually doesn't push it away. It doesn't try to tell you that you need to see it through the artist's eyes. It, when it works well, is literally like, it's welcoming you to like project onto it.
I love what you said about that connection and kind of that energy and that feedback from an audience. And I was wondering if you found that to be more difficult to establish with online teaching than with in the flesh teaching.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think there's definitely there's a real connection that can be made online.
Mhm.
Like, I think after so many years of many people trying to say that, you couldn't have intimacy in an online conversation, I think you can.
Yeah.
But I did realize, in particular with teaching, there are moments that I cannot do without being there in person.
Yeah.
And I think it has to do with just being human and seeing someone else do something, and it kind of like alleviates pressure. And yeah, so I do feel like there's some things I can't do.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's even like in terms of like bodily space and like reading physical cues to each other, I think it's something that I have paid attention to. And again, thinking about performance, like it's like read the room.
Right.
It's like read the
Well,
room, and like you pay attention to how your body impacts it, and you move back, or the sound of your voice, or any of those
yeah,
things.
well, and it's three-dimensional, and there's a
Yeah,
whole usually there's a whole bunch of bodies in a room, and you pick up on lots and
yeah,
lots of stuff. And
yeah,
that's that's impossible online. But I have noticed in my teaching there's other moments where like the people open up in ways that they wouldn't, or maybe hadn't for like the last months. And all of a sudden I have students who are just like blossoming, and there's something
yeah,
about the line makes them comfortable, and that can be so there's yeah, different formats work differently.
yeah.
I wanted to jump over from like the shifter talk a little bit away from being a storyteller to kind of like the point or the purpose of telling stories, and kind of to pick up on the ideas of artistry, aesthetics,
Mhm.
artistic license, and truth.
Mhm.
And so why are you a storyteller?
Um, I think of storytelling as a form of safety, of indicating to people out in the world that it's like I'm telling this story to make space for you, to let you know that like we share something,
Mhm.
because I think there's the kind of storytelling which is I guess it's more sort of like sharing secrets, or like being intimate with somebody, or just really letting somebody see you truly not perform crying, but truly move yourself to crying, to sadness, to happiness, to any of those things. And I think it just sort of shifts those boundaries about how we can coexist to each other.
Uh-huh. Hmm.
And I think that is, I learned about art growing up, and partially my responsibility, it's the way that I wanted to see it. Like art was like the big ART, and it sat at this kind of pinnacle, and I didn't realize that you could feel that empowered feeling through humility, or through the humbleness of materials,
Uh-huh.
or my love of craft and of historic material culture. It just immediately invokes a kind of grounding, right? When you look at something that's like old, and it conjures a narrative about who the maker was, where the materials came from, how the choices were made, what it meant then versus what it means now. And there's kind of humanity to it.
So
And
it's
that's, yeah, I mean, I feel like, I guess I'm hesitating to say that I think my narrative is unique, because I don't think it is unique in certain contexts, but then in other contexts I realize that it is unique. And I feel like one of those things, for instance, is like, even in the past like 5 or 6 years, people saying, well, why do you identify as a Native American artist? Like, don't you think that that's pigeonholing yourself?
huh.
And my response has always been, well, to be honest, if I don't put it out there, there's a constant question about like, do you know what race he is? Or are people getting it wrong? Or people just guessing? And also, we still describe each other by race.
Mhm.
And so I was like, I don't enter into art worlds where I see very many Native American people. So it's a form of me kind of establishing that it's like, yes, a Native American artist is here,
Mhm.
and that is the lens that I want you to look at the work through, in part.
Mhm.
And that's part of my story,
Well,
so
I
it's like
think
out to other people.
that's not the end of the story. That's the start of the story.
it's just one of the elements, but it's one of those ones that holds charge, you know. And then there's ones that I've learned, you know, love, relationships, pain, time, faith, like these other things are parts of the story as well. You know, some people have asked me over the past year, I've started thinking about these kinds of things that come out of the studio that I send out into the world. And we think, you know, like someone said, well, like, are you casting spells? Like, is that what's going on? And I was like, well, I mean, I don't know. Just like, I was like, I do think you put something in a space and it hopefully has like an impact. I think about the artworks that I'm a huge fan of Curator Kent, you know. We have a number of Curator Kents in our home. And the one that I look at every day, drink my coffee in front of, says people like us work power. And it's important to me that like my kids see this every single day. So did Karita cast a spell? I was like, well, kind of. I mean, it's just like, I am enchanted. I want to look at this every day. I want to be reminded of this every day. And I want it to start a story, you know, because those words, people like us, are so, they could be a million different things, you know?
Yeah. Well, I love the phrase people like us because it can be all different connections. Like to me, immediately we all fall into, you know, at least 5 or 6 different us's.
Right.
And then like, and they all don't overlap, but they all, I mean, they all don't, they're not concentric, but they all overlap at parts. And that's where it gets really interesting, where we.
And then the funny thing is like when it becomes internalized and you're all looking at each other going like, people like us, you know, it's like, and then, you know, then there's this other word in the same print that just says work power. And it's something that I think a lot about in terms of labor, and just sort of like the energy it takes to like accomplish something or to do something. So I think, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if it's an art specific thing for me, but it's definitely where I have found it in artworks that I look at and I want to live amongst, you know.
And by works of art, you mean song, you know, even pop songs, craft,
totally,
modernist abstraction, any well-designed teapot, any sort of thing.
Music. I mean, Prince. Do you think Prince was casting spells? I was like, yes.
Good ones. So for you, it's much more a matter of like showing rather than telling, in a way, in your work. So maybe the title of the show shouldn't be telling stories, but showing stories, or stories that show. But it's really you're enacting something. You're bringing it to life.
Yes, and there's also definitely like a kind of resistance to like closing it up, you know. And I guess that's the thing, is how I think about how stories end, is there's sort of the end or the resolution or whatever. And I think maybe, I mean, my relationship to text and words has changed, but my resistance to words in the beginning was that they felt so finite and that they had like singular meanings. And then when you start using them, you realize, no, they actually are pretty slippery, and they can go in a million different directions. And so I think the you know, visual material, the way that I use text, I feel like it still actively leaves gaps, you know, in terms of kind of like finishing. Doesn't ever finish.
No, so like, and part of the point of telling a story is to get more listeners to speak up.
Right.
And that can go on, hopefully keeps going on to me. And then that's the legacy. If your gap's all closed and your work is finished, well, put it in a crate and put it in the basement.
Right. And I also, you know, I mean, in my mainly like, well, undergrad and graduate study, you know, it was like this period of like what's the word? But basically, like, authorship was something that people felt like, you know, you were just putting it out there for other people to take and do whatever they needed to do with it.
Yeah.
So like ownership, and that has totally shifted, I know,
Mhm.
but that was such like a learning moment for me to like understand that it's like, oh, we can contribute to culture in a way that it becomes available to everybody,
Mhm.
you know. And I think that there's something really wonderful about that, and I think it pays back, definitely.
Yeah. And it really is regenerative.
Yeah.
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 And I also like at the beginning you said something about you want to engage lots of different narratives with your work, like historical narratives, political narratives, aesthetic narratives. And I love that kind of layered inclusiveness, or kind of like simultaneity of all kinds of different voices circulating through.
Yeah. Yeah. I think also, I mean, part of that is just about acknowledging, you know, and acknowledging like the truth of where what I'm being credited with as my thoughts.
Mhm.
It's just acknowledging, well, like, well, it actually comes from Seminole patchwork, or it actually comes from, you know, hide painting on teepee liners, or any of those sorts of things. I think it's, I feel like when I work, I'm a great editor when it comes to my work, you
Mhm.
know, but really there's this huge influx of ideas that come together. And at some point I start thinking about how and what they communicate to you as a viewer. And I start editing, because there's always other pieces these things can be deposited into.
Uh-huh.
But I think that there's still this like kind of DNA of acknowledging the greater world
Mhm. Mhm.
that is contributed to this,
Mhm.
you know, or this story.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. And that might be a beautiful spot to stop.
Wow, that was easy.
Oh, good. Now, all you have to do is show up and be present, and things work out
That is a good lesson. Yeah, I agree.
most of the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Jeffrey,
Thank you.
for doing this. And maybe the show will happen sometime somewhere. Yeah, we'll
Yeah.
we'll see. But good luck with all the everything going on in
Awesome.
your family unit. Our little foursome is bumbling along.
So
The kids adapting way better than the parents.
yeah, yeah, I know. Wacky world.
Yeah.
Well, it's great to see you.
Yeah, really, really good to see you. And I'm gonna hit stop recording so Savannah doesn't have too much to work with, and I think I actually have to stop everything when I stop that. So thanks again, Jeff, and I'll hopefully see you
All
again
right.
soon. Okay,
All right.
bye
Bye-bye.
bye.